Hello and welcome to another episode of The Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's episode, our 301st weekly episode, we're going to be looking at three titles. We're going to begin with the graphic biography, José, A Revolutionary Life, written by John Lee Anderson with art by José Hernández. We're going to look at the first two issues of David and Maria Lapham's The Lodger. And then we're going to wrap up by looking at the #1 issue of Kieron GIllen and Stephanie Hans's Die. First issue.
Sounds
pretty
good
cool
to me.
But before we get to that discussion, we want to let everyone know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. And if you go now to pre-order, Die #3, one of the series that we're talking about, is solicited for 40% off. And The Lodger #5 is solicited for 35% off.
You know, you really can't beat the great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. If for no other reason, discount is in their name. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
With bells on, or Tams on. We have Tams.
That's right, Tams on, yeah. And in fact, both Sterg and I are wearing or at least part of our regalia. We don't have mortarboards. We have the cooler Tams.
That's right.
And the reason why we're doing this, and if you're listening to this as an audio podcast, then it's already happened, and there's no way of seeing this except to go to our YouTube page. But we're doing something very special for this episode. It is a live streaming via Google Hangouts and YouTube that are integrated. And we came up with the idea of doing this. This is something actually I've been wanting to do for a few years. I know I couldn't get a former co-host to do this with me. Sterg, though, is fearless.
I am without fear. That's right. True, actually.
Yeah, you and Matt Murdock.
Yeah, I would be a Green Lantern if there were Green Lanterns.
Okay, but you're a man without fear, and you said, "Hey, let's jump into this." And we wanted to do this last week. We celebrated our 300th regular review show. Now we have many more episodes than that. I think we're approaching about 800 now with the interviews and the monthly series and specials and all that. But when it comes to our weekly show that goes up every Wednesday, last week was our 300th, and we thought, that was a pretty cool milestone. Why don't we do something kind of special following up on that? And so Sterg and I thought that we would figure out how to do this whole live streaming thing and record this week's episode, which actually will go up on our feed. The audio will, not the video, but the audio will go up tomorrow, Wednesday, the 12th. Now, the video will be available after we finish this. It'll be saved in YouTube, and so it will be accessible on our YouTube channel. So if this becomes, let's say, a slow train wreck, this experiment, then you can watch us make fools of ourselves via a YouTube video. But if you're watching now, I see we have one viewer. We encourage everyone who actually finds us to say something in the chat room, and we'll try to respond to that. I know I sent out messages or emails via our email list that we're going to be on live today at 1 p.m. Eastern. Tweeted about this, posted on Facebook. And so, we have 2 viewers now. So I hope that some of our regular listeners will stop in at some point and just see what the heck is going on. So this is kind of special. We've never done live streaming before. And I know Sterg and I wanted to make sure we did it right. And apparently, so far, so good.
Yeah. We're either brave or incredibly crazy.
Yeah, either one of those two. So, but, outside of the reference, the self-referential comment that we made about live streaming, this being our first time, we're not going to be doing anything different, right? So from here on in, outside of maybe commenting on what people say in the chat room, this will be just a regular episode. Okay.
I was planning on juggling, but I will ixnay that.
Well, maybe we could take a break halfway through for
That's
your
right.
juggling.
Or lack thereof.
Yeah. And again, we're wearing Tams because, after all, we are two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
It's true. Here's a comic. We're going to talk about it.
That's right. But before we talk about the first title, I want to actually make an announcement. Yeah, gotta love the bumpers. No, the announcement is, over the past month and a half, we've gotten some new patrons through Patreon, and we've been kind of lax in announcing that. But I want to take this opportunity now to say a big thank you to the 3 newest backers of our Patreon campaign. And their names are Tom Lake, Aristatus Kotsis, and I'm probably mispronouncing that name, Mr. Kotsis, so please forgive me, but thank you very much. And then Nadi, Nadhii, and there was no last name with that account on Patreon, so I'm assuming that this may be just a first name. So Nadi, Eratestis Kotsis, and Tom Lake, thank you very much for being the newest backers on our Patreon program.
We appreciate your support, and thank you for being there.
Yeah, and we also want to thank the other patrons who've been backing us for a little longer or a lot longer and who stuck with us. Thank you very much for your support. And if you want to find out more about what we do and what we offer on Patreon, then you can go to patreon.com and do a search for the Comics Alternative, or you could go to the Comics Alternative, comicsalternative.com, and you'll find there a link on the very first page, and also on other pages and postings within the site, a link to our Patreon program with a little illustration of me and Sterg saying back us on Patreon. And in fact, in the coming weeks, Sterg and I are going to completely revamp the Patreon campaign to make it even more attractive to our listeners.
You won't recognize it, but you might recognize it. It'll just be spiffier.
Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and begin with the very first text that we're going to be looking at for this week's episode, and that is Shay, A Revolutionary Life, written by John Lee Anderson with art by José Hernández. And this came out the middle of November from Penguin Press.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right, Derek. And I'm holding it up, visual aid for those of us who are watching. This is a really interesting book for me. And I know that it's one of those things that you ever read the Book of Lists? You know, the Book of Lists.
Oh, I think I've seen it years and years ago, but
it's an old book, but in it, there's a whole bunch of like lists of things. And one of them was Vincent Price had a thing about, if you can invite 4 people to dinner, who would they be? And I put it up on Facebook like years and years ago. And one of the people I put on was Che Guevara, because to me, he's one of those people that he's an enigma to me, because he's kind of a legendary figure. And my intention with it was something about thinking about, okay, I'd like to talk to this guy and get to see what he was really like, because, there's a lot of, it's up in the air. And I remember one of my friends who I went to college with, who was a poli-sci major, just came out and like vehemently said something like, that guy's like a murderer and a thug, and I can't believe you would want to have that guy over at dinner with all these other people that you have. And like, that's just disgusting, which is a very vehement, strong reaction. Mm-hmm. And I bring all this up because of the introduction, actually, by John Lee Anderson, who wrote a biography of Che Guevara, like not illegitimate. I'm taking that back.
An actual print prose biography.
Yes, he wrote a book in the 90s without pictures about Che Guevara that the artist José Hernández, who is a political cartoonist in Mexico, took up and adapted. So I don't think Anderson had as much to do with the creation of this book other than his biography is the source material that this political cartoonist took up. And I bring all this up because in the introduction, Anderson talked about how Shea is a very contentious figure who, you know, is deified almost or mythologized by many. And also he mentioned a couple people in particular that are like expats in Florida who make it their lives missions that every time somebody posts a picture of Shea in a positive light on social media that they go and they tear it down and they just comment about how, you know, this guy was a murderer and this guy was a lot of other horrible things. And so that tension is something that, to me, I was wondering about as I read the book, because to me, a lot of this book is, I appreciated it showing him kind of as a human person, but he's a very principled person. You know, when I read it, and I've read a couple other things, like I'm not going to say I'm an expert on Che Guevara by any means, but a few years ago, Spain Rodriguez did a graphic biography, which mostly focused on the Cuba years and not so much the rest of his life. And you've read Spain comics before, right? Like,
right. Yeah. I just haven't read Spain's Shea. I remember when it came out, but that's just one that I never got around to reading.
Well, for me, I read it and I appreciated the historical context, but I had a hard time divorcing it from Spain comics because, you know, Spain had a very strong viewpoint and he had these like ultra masculine heroic figures that definitely,
like Trash Man.
Yeah, like Trash Man, but like definitely like extreme in a sense of, you know, like the lengths they will go to enforce justice or create a sense of justice. And in reading that book, I kind of felt like Shea could have been Trash Man in a way, just the way I read that book. And maybe I'm not doing it justice, but I was like, okay, this is just another ultra masculine reactive figure that is, you know, enforcing this code of justice. And then, but you know, I'm not going to say it's like romanticized, but it's like, it's almost like he's the super heroic, you know, socialist or something like that. I've also seen
in Spain's, you mean?
In Spain's, right? In Spain's, and I've also seen Motorcycle Diaries. Did you ever see? I've seen the movie, and I remember that. I mean, Shea famously wrote a bunch of diary entries that have been published as the Motorcycle Diaries. And in that movie, he's kind of like dreamy and young, and he's driving his motorcycle through South America, and he's seeing all these, you know, people who are living humble and downtrodden lives, and it's the thing that kind of inspires him to do what he's going to do. But to me, that's like a very romantic thing, and I guess I'm talking about all of this as like prelude to this book because I think it's a fairly straightforward depiction of his life. Like it definitely goes chronological. It starts, you know, he's young and he's just out of med school and he's dealing with his family. And then, you know, it does the progression of, you know, he finds this calling. He ends up in Cuba. He has a lot to do with the Cuban Revolution. And
some of the almost sidetracks, right? Because his meeting Hilda, who is a, you know, fellow revolutionary, them having a relationship, her becoming pregnant.
Right. And to me, the thing in this book, which I think the introduction made it sound like Anderson wanted to trouble Che Guevara, and you know, he's like this contentious figure, and they wanted to do that. In this book, I think it's more of a came off to me more of a kind of like a person who sacrificed his life for ideals, maybe. And to me, he kind of came off as like I mean, I love the artwork in this book. Like José Hernández's depictions are very realistic, and I have no idea what his political cartoons look like. I'm very interested in looking at that now. But in this, it's like, I mean, it's not like extreme photorealistic, but it's, you know, the people definitely, they're historical figures, and you recognize Castro as Castro, and you recognize Shea as Shea. And to me, one of the things I really appreciated was kind of seeing, you know, those kinds of things captured. But for me, it felt like the things that you had mentioned, you know, Shea gets in a relationship. Shea has a family. Shea loves his mother. Shea loves his family, but he really doesn't have contact with them after a while because he kind of feels this calling to this larger issue, or this, you know, he needs to help the world become free, or he wants to spread socialism, and he wants to help the world become free from like dictatorships or business interests or those people who would keep, you know, the little people down. And he wants to spark up the people to rise and take up for themselves.
Right. And this is something that actually toward the beginning of the book, his family realizes, right? Because when he, you know, graduates with his medical degree and he's at the train station and his family is there to see him off, one of the, I think it may be his mother, says that something to the effect of, we'll never see him again. You know, not that he would necessarily get killed. I mean, that definitely is a possibility because of his beliefs, but he is, and they understood, at least the way I read this, that he was so enthralled, so anchored in his political passions, you know, in his ideology, that he would be swept up in that at the expense of coming back to see his family. Now, he does keep in touch because we do get every now and again excerpts from letters that he writes his mother, basically saying, you know, this is going on with me. I experienced this, thinking of you, things of that sort. Right. But I remember that scene at the train station, they more or less just assume we're never going to see him again.
Right. And for me, I think that's kind of the humanizing aspect of this book. You know, you see that he's got a family, that he has sacrificed those kinds of relationships in service of this higher cause. I think he just sees it as a higher cause. Like, he is going to go and he helps Castro take, you know, control in Cuba and helps that regime, you know, spread, you know, have a socialist government there. And, you know, which he sees as like to the betterment of humanity. And he puts his money where his mouth is. I mean, he leaves his wife and children there and says, okay, well, I'm not going to leave you anything. I'm just going to leave you there with no possessions other than you will be taken care of by the state, because that is the function of the state as we set it up. And then he kind of goes around the world to various other hot spots. Like he tries in Argentina. No, he doesn't start in Argentina. He starts in, he doesn't go to Bolivia. I forget where he went. He went somewhere else. Things did not. He did go to Guatemala, but he went somewhere else
before Cuba. Yeah.
Yes. Well, after Cuba, he goes to a place where it didn't happen. I will find it in the book, but it doesn't happen there. And then he ends up in the Congo, and it doesn't happen there because the contexts aren't the same. And then he ends up in Bolivia, where things really go south for him, and that's where he dies.
Yeah.
And to me, I mean, I learned a lot from his, you know, about his later days. I really didn't know a lot about Shea's later days. I know a lot about his you know, his youth and kind of the Cuba stuff. And so I appreciated learning about that. I appreciated the artwork. I really loved, especially at the end when he goes into the various disguises and he's unrecognizable, because you think of Shea as like the guy on the cover, you know, the guy who looks like that, you know, the guy on the t-shirt that you've seen Shea as like a symbol.
Yeah. The scraggly beard, the cigar,
right.
The beret.
And he's depicted like that a lot in the book. But this is a roundabout way of me talking about what I liked about the book is that it tried to humanize him, but I also think in a lot of ways that for me, it seemed like a labor of love, that Hernández had read this biography and really enjoyed it and felt moved to adapt it. And I think he did an excellent job. My issue is that it seems to leave out a lot of the things that Anderson brought up in the introduction, like the fact that Shea had a part in executing hundreds of people in Cuba, and nowhere in this book do we see Shea executing anybody. And so like all the things that other people like to bring up are not in this book. And Shea kind of comes off as he's not the superhero type he is in that Spain biography, but he's kind of still like this sainted figure who has given his life to this cause at the sacrifice of his family and relationships. And, you know, kind of like human emotion, honestly. It's like he's just out there in the world and he doesn't really have contact with people. He's just like, I give up everything because I want socialism to be everywhere. And then he kind of pays the ultimate price for it and kind of becomes, well, he doesn't he becomes a martyr for it. And the way that the book ends kind of brings that up about how the fact that the Bolivian government had buried him in a mass grave because they didn't want people to deify him, basically, or be able to locate where he was and, make it a destination site or anything like that. And how that kind of happened anyway in the 90s when a retired general revealed where Shea had been buried, and people did erect a monument. And, it kind of ends on this note, like, he is still a symbol. He's got the benefit of not being Castro. Castro got old, and kind of, the energy of that revolution kind of stagnated. And so Shea is always like the young, or he's always viewed as like the young guy in the beret with the cigar and the scraggly beard. And there's a romance about that I think this book conveys a lot of. And like I said, I'm not going to say it whitewashes his life, but a lot of the nitty gritty stuff, I kind of thought it would be in there because, it's kind of pitches like, this is going to be this complete, and the way it's introduced is like, it's going to be this nuanced biography. And a lot of that nuance, I mean, there's things in there, but a lot of the kind of negative lights that he could be seen in by many is not really present in this book.
Okay. So do you think that in adapting this, the graphics to Anderson's original text, that, or maybe, and I'm not familiar with Anderson's original biography, so I can't compare this. I mean, we could look at this kind of as a side issue. We can look at this as another example of comics and adaptation. I mean, usually when we're talking about adaptation or adaptation and graphic narrative, it's usually fiction for the most part. This is different though, but I would consider this a comics adaptation. But coming back to what I was saying, I'm not sure if Anderson's original biography, I don't want to say whitewashed, or at least didn't include some of the more, let's say, less attractive aspects of Che Guevara. But I'm wondering if Hernández did a little bit of editing of his own. What do you think?
I mean, I tend to think Hernández did more editing, and I don't, like you, I'm not familiar with Anderson's biography, but from his introduction, I kind of got the sense that he included a lot more of the kind of negative aspects of Shea's life in those, in that biography. And from what I can gather, that biography, when it came out, seemed to be more of a, like a book that uncovered or shed a lot more light on his life than was previously known. Like it was more of a definitive book about his life than had prior existed. And it seems to be well respected. I mean, definitely it's respected enough for somebody in Mexico to take it up and adapt it, which to me, is a sign that it was, it contained a lot of merit and a lot of that. But I tend to think that Hernández maybe was selective. I mean, and this is a very thick book. It's not like he skimped on material to get this adaptation. And maybe he just felt like, okay, I'm not going to put all that stuff in. I'm going to focus on a lot of the other aspects of Shea's life. And maybe it's a thing where, it's one of those things I kind of wrestle with too. Like I use the word whitewash and we are two white guys talking about I'm guessing John Lee Anderson was a white guy, or is a white guy, that, this Mexican fella, Jose Hernández, adapted this book. So maybe, when representation, maybe Shea is kind of a necessary hero, or a, like one of those people that gets easy for me to be like, I have a friend that thinks he's a thug. I'm curious because I think it's much more up in the air. I think he's an enigma. To me, he could have that. He could be, he's got, I mean, in the book, he writes, the letters home are reproduced. And even his political writing, I mean, he's poetic. He uses language in an artful manner. I mean, he's not just like, this kind of militaristic murderer. Or if he is, he's not solely that. He's also got this kind of like poetic side where he does write artfully and he does express his political views in flowery, relatively flowery ways. And so to me, I mean, that's kind of like the interesting part about kind of why he endures, because he represents multiple things and he presents in multiple ways. And I mean, to me, that's fascinating. And I think that's one of the things that this book does very well is kind of get at, you know, he's in fatigues. He looks grungy. You know, he's living in the woods. He's doing, you know, he's fighting against the odds. Like, you know, he's almost no part of this book is he ever on the side of the majority. It's always like, you know, he's always in like some band of little people and they're trying to fight against overwhelming odds of, you know, a very well-financed and entrenched establishment. You know, and, you know, if this was Star Wars, we would be rooting the hell out of it for Che Guevara, you know?
Right. Well, that gets back to something that I was alluding to earlier and what I was asking you in terms of the quote unquote potential whitewashing. And again, I don't think that that's the most appropriate term for what Hernández is doing here. But if indeed the more, let's say, negative, what many would consider more negative or less attractive aspects of Che Guevara are really not being represented here. So, for instance, you mentioned him having certain people killed back in Cuba. Then my question would be, and not necessarily a direct one to you, but I guess kind of in a larger sense, is how different may this graphic biography, Che, A Revolutionary Life, be from other examples of the iconization of Che Guevara? You know, and you mentioned, you know, famous images of Che Guevara on T-shirts and, you know, painted on building sides and whatnot. And in many ways, it's creating almost in a Warhol-esque way. I mean, literally, I think you know, Warhol did images of Che. This kind of celebrity status, making him into an icon, you know, for better or worse. And if, I guess, what merchandisers and even artists have been doing with Che Guevara and his images in the past, might Hernández, who illustrated this, who apparently took Anderson's original biography and adapted it to comics form, might he be engaged in a somewhat similar project, perhaps unknowingly? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's a better way of saying it, because I think it's more of contributing to that iconography or that kind of mythologizing of him as a figure. And, you know, he's kind of, you know, and they talk about it at the end, it doesn't have the payoffs imagery, but in reality, when Che was murdered, I mean, they took pictures of his body, and there's famous pictures of him in the morgue, and his body is laid out, and, you know, it's a lot of people have commented about how it's Christ-like, and it looks like that, and he's kind of like, I am, you know, I died for my cause, I died for humanity. I mean, is how it's pitched a lot of the time. And
I think Anderson even references that Christ-like imagery in his intro, doesn't he? Am I remembering correctly? Okay,
he does. And somebody, I forget what it was, but he mentions a person who I think has made his academic career, basically, or a large part of his academic career, is cataloging those things, because apparently it's a very, you know, it's a regular occurrence, or it's something that, you know, there's plenty of examples of it throughout history. So, you know, to me, this book does that. I mean, the human parts are more of the sacrifice things. I think that's really what it sold to me. The fact, you know, that he has all these kids, and, you know, it's heartbreaking at the end. You know, the book kind of ends with a letter he wrote to his kids in the event of his death. And he has, I think, 4 or 5 children. So it's, you know, it's kind of heartbreaking. He doesn't know them. He doesn't know most of them. Like the 2 oldest ones he has, you know, he's like, the way he talks about it, he's like, well, you probably remember something. The other 2 will not know me at all. And at one point he actually goes back and sees them, but he is such a like a hunted political figure internationally that he does it under disguise, and his wife knows who he is, but his kids don't know who he is, and they lie and say he's their uncle, and they don't recognize him. And it's like a kind of heartbreaking, horrible thing in a way, to think like, okay, you're going to visit your kids and be with your kids, and they won't know it's you, and they think you're just some other dude. And, you know, like it's kind of like a tragicomic little scene, because he plays a lot with his oldest daughter. And at the end, when he leaves, she's maybe 8. I mean, she's very young. And she kind of turns to her mother after he leaves and says, "Mama, I think he's in love with me," which is sweet and adorable, but it's also crushing, because it's like, you know, it's like he only has a handful of moments with his family, you know, because he's all doing this other work. You know, he's out living in, you know, jungles basically, and, you know, trying to scratch together an existence and also, you know, do political justice. So I don't know. It's like I said, I have really conflicting feelings. And in that way, I think this book is very successful because it brings up a lot of different emotions and aspects of him. You know, I don't think it goes far enough in showing the kind of more brutal aspects of what he did. You know, but it definitely shows him as a, you know, I think properly enigmatic person, where maybe he's a little too saintly for my liking or my guessing, but I still think it's a very worthy book. I really enjoyed reading it and rereading it. Actually, it was one of these things that I had to go back and revisit things and remember things, just because I don't know. It was just one of those. A lot of the kind of events kind of follow in each other, or there's kind of patterns to them where he falls in with a group and they kind of, their morale goes low and things go south. And, you know, I just wanted to keep straight what was going on, because honestly, as a little kid, what I knew about Che Guevara was, I think, what like Chevy Chase said on like Weekend Update on SNL, which has, you know, it was jokey. So I had no idea. And this is much more, you know, getting all these things filled in about like Angola and stuff like that.
Yeah. You know, I want to, yeah, like you, I did enjoy this graphic biography, but there were a couple of things that I wish had been a little different, or at least one thing that had been a little different. And I also wanted to talk with you about, I guess, another experience that I had in reading this. And I'll start with that. The latter reference that I was about to make, and that is, I'm wondering if, as you were reading this, and because you haven't read the original Anderson biography,
right,
like me, were there places in this narrative that you felt that there were some gaps that, at least initially, weren't entirely clear or weren't filled in, but then later on you got a better sense of what was going on? I mean, there were sections of this book that were thrown into a new situation.
Yeah.
Going from one scene to another, going from one time to another, without any context whatsoever as to who certain characters were, what was going on. And I'm wondering, in the process of adapting the prose biography to graphic form, if Hernández may have been, how do I put this, maybe a little loose in terms of some of the information. I don't want to suggest that I was lost in the narrative. In other words, I was completely scratching my head, wondering, you know, what the hell's going on here? I really don't know. I'm frustrated. I'm going to close the book and not pick it up again. Never had that experience. But there were some times that at least I was beginning to enter a particular scene in Guevara's life, but I wasn't entirely sure what was going on. But I kept reading thinking, okay, the context will eventually seep through. Did you have that experience at times?
You know what question I had was, I wondered, you know how this book it's divided into 3 books. Like it's, there's, you know, part 1, part 2, and part 3. And I was wondering if they were published serially originally.
The comic?
Yeah, I'm wondering, only because that's where I kind of got lost. Like, I know what you're talking about, because there's sequences where the kind of the chronology gets weird, where it's like 3 years ago, 6 years later. Like that happens around the beginning of those books, or the beginning and ending of those, where the books end inside the whole volume. And
yeah, it's like we're going around in time, like what, Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. And we're lost.
Right. And so there's that, but then there's also the parts where there were parts in those areas where things get repetitious, because he had written a letter to his mother, and there's an image of a boat. At the end of book 1, there's like he's on a boat and he's going to Cuba. And he writes a letter about, you know, what he feels like he has to do. And then at the beginning of book 2, that letter is repeated, like not even 10 pages apart, and with different imagery, but it's still a boat. So it made me think, like, was this a serial where that was represented so that you could catch up, because in the space of one volume, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense, because I'm like, he just wrote that letter, and then we know he's on the boat, and then we open up the other book, and then we get the letter again with a different depiction of the same boat. And so I was like, what was the point of that? If it was serial, it would be kind of, like a recap almost in a way, or a kind of catch up part.
That's interesting. And I didn't even think about this originally until you made the comment that you just did about the question of possible serialization. And so I looked at the indicia, and this was originally published in Spanish in 2016.
Okay.
So we have Anderson's original prose biography that this is based on that came out in 1997. And then José Hernández published this in Spanish in 2016, which I just saw. And then now we have in 2018, the Penguin Press language or English language edition of this book. So it could be that in the original, it was serialized, because otherwise, why repeat at the very beginning of, as an example, you mentioned section 2, word for word, what was written in the very end of the first part? Yeah.
I mean, it just was curious to me, and it made me wonder if that was how it was originally presented, because there's on pages 106 and 107, there's kind of those depictions of the boat, and then on page 115, the same letter, and different scenery, but it's definitely the boat again.
Yeah.
And so I was curious about that. Like, there seemed to be it wasn't the smoothest reading narrative in a way, because it just seemed like there were aspects like that. And I don't think it detracted, like, nothing in this book made me think, like you said, like, I never at any point was like, oh, this is tripe and I'm just going to throw it across the room. And I got frustrated. Like, this is a very well done, gorgeous, meticulously drawn. And obviously a lot of passion and I would say love is in this book. That artwork is fabulous. Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah. And for those who are watching this live streaming, this is an example of some of the art. Yeah. Hernández really does a great job. And I think that the art in this book is one of the standout points. And why one of the reasons why people should definitely read this. Now, another issue that I wanted to bring up is the matter of language. There are a good number actually of sections in this biography, this graphic biography, where it's in Spanish. Sometimes that's with documentation, right? So it could be a letter, it could be a passport, but information is presented in Spanish and there's no English translation.
Right. And the newspapers, there's a lot of newspapers that tell you information. Exactly.
And I feel mixed about this. On the one hand, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary, and not just in this text, but any text that utilizes or incorporates another language for English readers outside of English, right? Because I think, so for instance, whether it be Spanish or French or Chinese, that actually, Chinese, Japanese may be a little different, but because you're dealing with different characters, character systems, but it would be incumbent upon the reader to do a little homework, right? And so it engages the reader to actually get up, so to speak, maybe figuratively, and look something up.
Right.
And it's easy enough to do this today with Google Translate. However, there are a lot of passages here that do this, and I think that it would have been nice in certain sections, if not on the page itself, then maybe in the back, to have a note section of what is actually being stated or written, let's say, on the passport or in the newspaper or in this letter. In other words, there's so many occurrences of the Spanish-only text in a variety of different contexts that it would be nice to have English translations of some sort somewhere in this book. And like I said, if it were just one or two instances, 2 or 3, I'd have no problem with this. Case in point, on the recent webcomics episode that Sean Kleefeld and I recorded, one of the webcomics that we looked at was Take the A Train by M. Dean and Z. Akhmetova.
Mm-hmm.
And in M. Dean's, basically it's a collaborative webcomic. And so M. Dean does half and Amektova does the other half. But in M. Dean's section, there are several panels that are only in Spanish. And so in order for me to understand what was going on, and I think that webcomic, at least her half of it, was about 8 pages. So it wasn't that long at all. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a lot of text to translate. So basically I just went to Google Translate and typed in the Spanish and got the English translation. That was easy enough to do. It'd be much more difficult to do that here with Anderson and Hernandez's graphic biography. So that's one of the, I felt that at times I was maybe missing out on some of what was going on, and especially in instances like you mentioned with the newspapers. We have a lot of those instances where what's going on with the revolution or the revolutionaries, their successes or even their failures, is written up in the papers. I get that, but I'd like to be able to read what's actually being written in these newspapers, but it's in Spanish. Unfortunately, I really don't know Spanish. So I wish that there had been at least some basic attempt, if nothing else, to translate some of the Spanish only pages or images, maybe in a notes section in the very back.
Yeah. And I wondered if this could be like almost like a manga where, because obviously to me, those things were part of the artwork, the original art.
Right.
But so, manga, they don't translate. They put in a little asterisk, and then in the margins, they tell you things.
Yeah. Sometimes they do that, or depending on the publisher, or I guess even the text in the mangaka, an index in the back or a note section in the back. I know that that's something that Kodansha does fairly frequently with a lot of their authors, in that there'll be Japanese text that's a part of the art that they really can't translate as easily. And so if you turn back to the notes section, then you find out what the characters actually represent, or they'll give some kind of context. So let's say a character will make a reference to something that is, culturally speaking, is understood by Japanese readers, but not necessarily by Western readers. And so they'll include that information in the notes section as well. So I think maybe a notes section would have been nice. I don't think it's necessary for me to, in terms of my appreciation of what Hernandez is doing here. But again, there were just those passages that at times I felt I'm not really wrapping my brain around this because I don't know the language.
Yeah. And I have a slight advantage of that. I understand Spanish and I can read it maybe up to like 3rd grade. So I understood most, I mean, not everything, but for the most part, I would, it took me a little bit, but it was definitely, a little bit more work than the rest of the text. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's one of those things that, like you said, it affects the reading experience. In one way it's authentic, and in another sense, it's difficult if the whole rest of it is translated and those things aren't. Although I really liked, for me personally, because they showed the Spanish language letters, especially the letters, because those were translated in caption boxes, and I really loved how those were doing, because I could look at the Spanish and kind of go back and forth, and it was I think it made it better for a better reading experience for me in those instances, because I had kind of the ability to kind of go from language to language and see how it was originally put versus how it was translated. And there's a little nuance here and there, and I'm not saying like I'm the most brilliant understander of reading in other languages, but every once in a while there's a word choice or something I'm like, oh, that's unique, or that's interesting. Or,
and by the way, that's the official term for that, an understander of foreign languages.
You heard it here first. You come here, look, we have TAMs on. We are really smart people. And we know the words.
and if we don't, we make them up.
Yeah. And
we're like Humpty Dumpty in that way.
And I want to say something, because the chat that kind of goes alongside this is basically, I think I'm just talking to you, but I just went to YouTube, and Aris Kotsis is out there, and he said, I'm glad I can see you online, and this is fun. And we're glad we can see you, because I'm psyched. Our first comment live.
Yes. Okay, so I'll have to go to YouTube to look at that because I've got my group chat up. So apparently the only people who contributes to the group chat are just contributors of the Hangout. Okay, we're learning this as we go along, guys. But we're glad you're watching us.
Woohoo! I'm going to assume you're Greek. I'm going to say Yasu and bienvenidos. That's actually not. That's actually Spanish. We're going to go multilingual in this episode.
Okay, Sterg, do you want to move on to the second title that we're going to be looking at for this week's episode? And this is the first 2 issues of The Lodger. Issue number 1 came out in October, and the second one is a December release. And this is written by David and Maria Lapham with art by David Lapham, and it is coming out through IDW's Black Crown imprint. So this is, I think, the latest in Shelley Bond's Black Crown releases. And I can't remember if you and I have talked much about Black Crown. I don't think we've reviewed a Black Crown title before, have we? Since you came on board?
We haven't since we've been on board, and I've only literally read one Black Crown title. I read Assassinistas, the one that it was Gilbert Hernandez drew, and he did not write it though.
No. Yeah, I've read at least the first issue of if not all of them. Well, no, I think all the releases from Black Crown, except for the Black Crown Quarterly, but for their series, Assassinistas, Punk's Not Dead, and I'm forgetting some of the other. Kid Lobotomy, and then the others. I think that I have read. And most of them we've even discussed on past episodes of the Comics Alternative. But this is the first time you and I are really talking about Black Crown. It's interesting, and maybe to set a little context before we get into the nitty-gritty of what the Laphams are doing with the Lodger, because I think it's fascinating. It can be confusing, but fascinating. At about the time that IDW began their Black Crown imprint, Dark Horse started Burger Books. I think Burger Books came just a little after. But because they came out at about the same time, and because both Karen Berger and Shelley Bond had been editors of DC's Vertigo, first Berger and then Bond, I tend to, if not lump the two together, Black Crown and Berger Books, but maybe compare them and contrast them. And I have to say that I've been, on the whole, a little more impressed with Burger Book releases than I have with Black Crown. That being said, though, I really have enjoyed most of what I've read in terms of the Black Crown imprint. And so I was quite excited when we saw several months ago a solicit for a new Black Crown title by David Lapham, because I'm a big David Lapham fan, and I think you are as well, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's one of those, and I thought about it with this series especially. He's, I like a good noir story, and it amazes me how many of them he has in them, and how many different ones. Just because just with Stray Bullets going, and then this, and it's like it's a different thing, but it's kind of equally as compelling and horrific. It's like gruesome and. Like I don't know, it's like a good, like what I expect out of this story in a lot of ways. Like, to me, he's kind of like a spiritual, like a John D. McDonald or one of those Donald Westlake or something, like one of those people that seems like they could just churn out these stories. And I say churn out like it's gonna be bad, but they're not bad. They're all like high quality, which is kind of stupefying to me that these people can, like Jeff Lemire or somebody like that. I'm like, where do these stories all come from, and why are they all awesome? And how do you have that facility? David Latham is one of those guys for me. Yeah.
Now, I'm a big fan of Stray Bullets, and I guess the original Stray Bullets, before it was picked up or published through Image, I'd read all of. And I haven't been as diligent at keeping up with, I guess, his latest storyline, Sunshine and Roses. And I think one of the reasons is I started it, but then I thought, okay, I'm going to wait until this is finished. And a couple of years ago, I thought, okay, well, this won't last for maybe any more than 1 or 2 trades. Little did I know that I can't even remember what issue number we're up to now in terms of Sunshine.
It's 40. I looked
40.
it up.
I was about to say 30 some, but yeah, 40. So, I mean, who knows when he's going to wrap it up? So I'm not as up to date with his current work with Image. But one of the things that I thought about as I was reading the first 2 issues of The Lodger is, I was asking myself, why not do this with Stray Bullets? Under the Stray Bullets banner. And I think it would easily fit within Stray Bullets. I mean, he's currently playing out his Sunshine and Roses narrative. Okay, so I understand that. But also, I think coming to Black Crown gives him another potential outlet as well. But you're correct in that it's very much in, I guess, the same ballpark as what most people know Lapham from doing, and that is primarily his Stray Bullets works. So. I really enjoyed this. I mean, I guess first and foremost, I was predisposed to enjoy The Lodger just because I'm such a big fan of David Lapham. And I like his kind of crime noir writing, especially as strange as it can get at times. And we definitely get that in The Lodger. Not disappointed there.
Oh yeah. It's a creepy book too. And, and it's kind of got without it being, to me, it's one of the, there being a serial killer in this, that's one of those tropes to me that in general is largely played out. I don't know, in my mind, it takes a lot for me to get excited about a serial killer narrative in general, just because I think that they're almost written like superheroes. They have some kind of innate weird superhuman ability to avoid crime. They're caught or detection, or, they can read people's minds and get into their house and do things that they should not be able to do. And I don't know. There's something about that, the fact that there are people who like murdering people and to the point where they do it repeatedly is creepy enough to me. I don't need them to be superhuman in their ability to do so. But to this, the framework is that there's a serial killer and one of the victims is basically plotting revenge and trying to lay traps to catch this serial killer, who pretends to be a lodger and ends up in people's houses and then murders them.
Yeah. Okay. Now you're starting to talk about this series premise.
Yes.
I was about to bring up, I guess, the Lapham's narrative approach and how, if not unique, then different from most of the things that we read, and it really impressed me. But let's talk about the content here, because there's something I want to ask you. Now, I'm right now at the IDW website, and they have a description for issue number 1 of The Lodger, and I'm going to read this. Okay. A handsome drifter murders his way through the Midwest while hiding in plain sight as a travel blogger, leaving families in shreds and body bags in his wake. Ricky Toledo was 15 when she fell hard for Dante until he killed her mother and got her father sent to prison for it. It's 3 years later, and Ricky will stop at nothing to get revenge. Lodger is a dark, grimy psychological thriller, a game of cat and mouse between a broken young woman and a serial killer, and like all the best crime noir, a twisted love story. Okay, so that is the solicit for issue number 1. And the solicit for issue number 2 is not that dissimilar. Now, in the first 2 issues, we don't see that Dante, at least necessarily directly, is a serial killer. We don't see that he killed Ricky's mother. We don't see that he got the father framed for it and sent to prison. And I'm wondering, when they wrote the solicit for Lodger number 1, and then something similar, as I said, goes on in the solicit for Lodger number 2. Why are they giving away
the plot?
The plot. I mean, I read these first 2 issues, and I gathered that there's something a little off about this guy called Dante. Yeah. Actually, I got more of a weird vibe from the female protagonist, Ricky, who goes by the nickname Nails. Right. A couple of points. But Ricky Toledo, I mean, I thought that the story was more about her, especially in the second issue. But we do get quite a bit of her in the first issue. Now, we do see Ricky's mother, in the second issue. There's no indication whatsoever by issue number 2, that again is a December release, the most recent, that Dante killed her.
Right.
There's no indication whatsoever that the father Matteo was framed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what's going on here. I like this I like the mystery aspect of the first 2 issues because I don't know what's up with Ricky. I don't know who this Dante guy is. I don't know, like, for instance, there's another young guy that at the beginning of issue number 2 is apparently talking with Dante, but it's a guy who calls himself Ricky.
Right.
So I don't know who this is. In issue number 1, we see this older couple, right? The woman who apparently is alien, Carla Ann, and then her husband, I'm assuming Carl. Who are these people? And what kind of links do they have to Ricky and Dante? I don't know. I'm okay with this mystery, right? These unanswered questions, especially since we're only 2 issues into this series. And so that's part of the fun, right? To try to put the pieces together, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. It's a mystery.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't know. The solicit, I didn't read the solicit actually until online, until after reading these first 2 issues. And I was kind of thrown that some of this stuff would go on, you know, that, oh, so apparently Dante is going to kill Ricky's mother and frame the father. Huh. Okay. Maybe I don't need to read the 3rd or 4th issue now.
Yeah. But there's a lot, like you said, that's, I don't know, beguiling is kind of the word I'm thinking about it, because things happen and you don't seem to kind of know exactly what they are. But then even in issue 2, which is, I think it just came out last week, there's some things that happen. I mean, with the scene that, who is it? Was that where Ricky dies? Where her father kills someone? That's not Ricky. It's Matteo.
Matteo. Well, yeah, Ricky's father, you know, he is drunk and he comes home one night. And
that's right.
Yeah, and he's going to throw out Dante because he's
right.
written a room. Dante's written a room.
So what her father does to Dante is one thing. And then towards the end, she kind of has this fracas in a honky tonk.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this one guy, you know, he doesn't even really push her. He just kind of says, "You all right?" And she freaks out. And she's like, "Who said you could talk to me?" And she, you know, does violence. And it seems to be like an exact reenactment visually of what happened to Dante, although this time she did it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like this. What I like about Latham's stuff in general is that he does a lot of like playing around with the narrative and echoing things and like lots of weird visual clues, because you know, I wouldn't say his artwork is fancy. It's attractive and it's very functional, but to me it's like a different version of, like, maybe not to the degree that Matt Kint draws, but there's a lot of like visual cues, I think, that contribute to kind of the intrigue or the mystery or why things are happening. And, you know, it makes you wonder, like, is this parallel? Is Ricky nuts? Is Nail, you know, is Nails nuts? You know, what is exactly happening? What's reality? What's not there? You know, and, you know, kind of strikes, it's not exactly the same thing, but kind of in the vein that like Amy Racecar did in the Stray Bullet books. Like, you didn't know what was real or what wasn't real. And I think Lapham does an excellent job. Like, historically, like, that's one of the things that appeals to me in his stories. You know, I really liked, what was the Vertigo book? Was it Young Liars?
Yeah. Oh God, I forgot about that series.
Oh yeah. That was good. I love that series. I mean, it was like 15 issues and it was just like, what? Like, you know, there are spiders living in people's, like, it was like the, you know, the Bowie song was real. Like, you know, there were spiders living in people's heads, but then there was like, are they living in people's heads? Are these just like people on drugs that are like hopped out and don't know what the hell's going on? And there was a lot of intrigue in that, like, and I loved it because it was just like this, like, boom, boom, boom. There's lots of action. There's lots of weird, you know, strong characters, you know, driven to do things. Like, their motivations are very clear, but you don't know if their motivations are pure or if they're compromised or if they're even legitimate.
Yeah. I want to talk more about the mystery and the question marks that I think are a hallmark of Lapham's style, because I think that'll get to that issue that I had said that I wanted to bring up, and that is the narrative structure, how the story is told. Before I do that, though, I noticed that Eris, because we were talking about the solicits, Eris, our one of our new backers on Patreon, wrote, "It's a bliss to not be able to remember the previous solicitations when reading a comic. I'm lucky that I forget so easily." And I think that there is something a little blissful about that, because sometimes the solicits, at case in point, what I read online at the IDW site, can kind of give things away. Another instance of this happening, and it wasn't necessarily a solicit, but it was the beginning of the first issue of a series. Did you read the first issue of Neil Gaiman's American Gods?
No, I read the book.
Horse?
I read the book a million years ago.
We reviewed the first issue of American Gods when it came out, and in the blurb that opened this first issue, information, it's kind of like the solicit for the Lodger, information of what will happen later was revealed. In other words, it was spoiled in that first issue, and I can't remember who reviewed that with me, but we couldn't figure out why in the hell did the Gaiman or whoever write what they did in such a way. So anyway, okay, so getting to what you were talking about in terms of storytelling style in ways that create ambiguity, and not unintentional ambiguity. I think healthy, necessary ambiguity, especially when it comes to crime noir. One of the things that impressed me about the first two issues of The Lodger is the levels of narration. Okay. And we have at least three going on, more or less. On the one hand, we have in the boxed, what you could call like the voiceovers, we have Dante's blog, which is being written after the events, many of which we see going on as they unfold in the comic itself. Okay. So that's one narrative level. A second narrative level is what I just referenced, the contemporary events that are happening with Ricky, her family, and the people that she encounters as it's going on. And then a third narrative level are the various flashbacks to what's going on. So for instance, when we see in issue number 2, Dante knocking on the door of Gloria and Mateo and Ricky, wanting to rent a room, that's a flashback. And when Ricky first meets this guy who goes by the name of Dante, that's a flashback. So it's not happening in contemporary time. However, the vast majority of issue number 1 is, I'm assuming, more recently things that are happening with Ricky when, she goes to this town in Michigan called Blossom, and she goes to see... She's looking for a guy named Freddie, and then there's and I can't remember the woman's name. It's the woman who owns the house, Southbird. I can't recall. But she apparently is dead on the bed, and then we see Ricky with a gun. And I mean, I as a reader automatically wondered, why does she have a gun? Is she the big bad, so to speak, in this series? Come to find out that at least by issue number 2, she doesn't seem to be. But again, why is she carrying this gun? She pulls it on a cop. Right. I mean, this is someone who's fearless. And also, she holds up a pub, an entire pub, not just one or two people. So, this is someone who's a little ballsy and desperate. I got the sense. Yeah. But again, there are a lot of questions there, but that is the more contemporary narrative level. And in many ways, and we see this, I think, more prominently in issue number 2 of The Lodger, there seems to be a disjunction between, let's say, Dante's blog as a narrative level and what's going on, or what had been going on, either in a more contemporary way or in flashbacks, because Ricky 1 or 2 times curses Dante as she's reading his blog, which is called The Lodger, because he's supposed to be a travel blogger. And he is misrepresenting the facts. And sometimes the misrepresenting the facts can be, I would call it, maybe relatively innocent. So for instance, not using the name of Ricky's parents, Gloria and Mateo, he uses other names, to protect the innocent, so to speak. But then there are other things that he writes about that kind of bend the truth, in the way that our current president does. And there you go. I had to throw that, I make it no secret about my political leanings on this podcast. I'm sorry for those of you who may be offended. But But Ricky, when she reads Dante's blog, curses him for not being truthful, someone who uses his blog to make himself look much more innocent than he actually is.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that disjunctive nature of those narrative levels.
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, it's like I was saying in a less artful way.
No, I thought you said it quite well.
He keeps you guessing about what's reality and what's not reality, and that's to me is like the hallmark of his work that keeps me coming back for more. And I really appreciate it. It's not necessarily in this instance, it doesn't look like some of his books are a little bit weirder, like sci-fi almost, but this is not. And this is I love a story like this where I don't know who I can trust, where Ricky's going to hold up a whole restaurant because she wanted she just went for a cheeseburger.
Yeah, she just wanted a burger,
and they just made life hard for her, so she makes it really hard for them. And just the way things kind of spiral, like it seems like sudden small things. Like that's another thing that he does excellent, I think, in his work. He starts with like these very small things, and then usually they escalate rapidly in insane ways. And so, like that one being, representative, she just breaks in to get a cheeseburger, which turns into like a robbery. I don't know, people getting their clothes thrown in a deep fryer, and then the whole restaurant held hostage. And there's some really other weird stuff too, like that. I'm not going to spoil it, but they kind of explain on page 34 why she's called Nails.
Oh yeah,
it's memorable. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
And pretty gross and horrifying.
Yeah, it is. I was just looking at, again, the IDW website to see how long this series
is. It just 5 issues?
I don't know. I looked at the initial write-up when they announced the Lodger, and I didn't see, maybe I overlooked it in reading it too quickly, about how many issues there was going to be. There are going to be. And then I looked at the individual solicit for issues 1, 2, and then 3, which comes out, I guess, this month as well. But there's no indication of how many issues this will be. And I can't remember if they mentioned the run in previews when this was originally solicited several months ago. I can't recall.
I want to say it runs 5 because in my head it's stuck. And I'm looking through IDW. I'm looking through the previews to see where it is. But I want to say it's only going to run 5 issues.
Okay.
So, yep. Number 5.
And I was wondering about this and bring it up because, we've been talking about the question marks, the mysteries, the ambiguity that is embedded in this narrative so far. And we're at issue number 2. Issue number 3, as I mentioned, comes out later this month.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of questions, to address, a lot of gaps to fill in the limited amount of time, if indeed it is just 5 issues. That comes from this. So who knows? I mean, maybe the first 5 issues is an initial arc, and who knows? Maybe he could go on with the Lodger in another arc, which could be a second trade. I don't know.
Yeah, and I love that her gun is called Gold Digger.
Gold Digger, yeah. Which she got. I guess we can assume she got from her father, because in issue number 2, when we're first introduced to her father, Mateo, we learn that, he doesn't work anymore because of an accident that he had on site. But now what he does is he fiddles with guns. He repairs guns, he cleans guns. And one of the things that he's done since he's quote unquote retired is to, I guess, make a gun out of gold, or at least part of its gold. And so that's what she has with Gold Digger.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that the previews for number 5, they say it's the end, and there's names in it and things, so I'm not reading anymore because I don't want things spoiled. Yeah.
IDW, the publisher, if they choose to spoil things, that's one thing, right? Because they own all that, but and the Laphams, but we don't. We try not to spoil. I think there have been some times in the past where we've accidentally spoiled something, or where we've disagreed on what actually is a spoiler. I know that there are a couple of times that Kunkka accused me of spoiling, but I made the argument, and I think persuasively, he may not have agreed, that what I stated was not really a spoiler because it didn't reveal a particular plot point, but it may have revealed what we already knew if you had read or even, started to read this, the narrative. So anyway.
We ruined Shay. I'm going to tell you, he dies at the end.
Okay. So. Okay, you want to move on to the final title that we're going to be looking at, and this is Die #1, written by Kieron GIllen with art by Stephanie Hans. Came out the first issue last week, December 5th, from Image Comics. And, it's funny because before I read this first issue, I thought that the title referred to death, die. And it can. But then I read the first issue and I thought, okay, so die doesn't only potentially refer to the act of dying or death. It is a single die, as in dice.
Yeah. And I liked it. I remember looking at this in the previews and talking about it with you as one of the attractive titles that really jumped out at me. And I mean, I'm really glad to say, and I love a pun. I'm like die because it's the same thing because it's the death or the killing die, and it's also the D&D die. Tassels are and don't,
by the way, don't get this mixed up with another Image comic die. I
was gonna say there's a whole lot of die. What's that other one what's the manga you like saying the title of the by the Goodnight Pun? What's that one called?
Oh, by Inio Asano's recent Dead Demons Destruction.
There you go.
And again, anytime I can say that, and I hope I got enough DDDDs in there. I think there are 4. So
see, there you go. See, I like hearing it. So I just want to hear.
Okay, so we had with Kirkman this series earlier this year, Die. Now we have GIllen and Hans's Die. I'm wondering if maybe in the new year we will get a title called Die.
Hey.
So then we have 1 die, 3 dies, and then 2 dies.
There's what's that? Oh, what's a good Die Kitty Cat? There's that.
Okay.
That Dan Parent.
But it's not an image. Yeah.
That's right. Well, they're cornering the market on the Die books.
Okay. But to get more, I guess, serious about what's going on here. I mean, this is really interesting in that I guess the premise of this, which is very much like, I couldn't help but think of Jumanji, and I was looking at the solicit for this on the Image site, and I think GIllen even calls it at one point a goth Jumanji. So there's that. I was also reminded, though, of It, right? Because you have in It, you have in Die, something very much like you have in It and also Jumanji in some ways. But with It, you have a group of young people who experience something horrific, and that binds them in a way that really can't be described or even denied, definitely. And the young people as adults get back together in order to collectively deal with what had happened to them when they were young. And I think you have, so if you could combine Stephen King's It and then the film Jumanji, the first one, not any, lame ass follow-ups.
I thought it looked good. I didn't see it, but
I don't know. I wasn't even a fan of the original Jumanji, to be perfectly honest, but that deals with my taste, and that's not
picture book is awesome. You should see the picture book. It has nothing to do with the movie.
Okay. Yeah, I'm out of touch with picture books now because it's been a long time since my kids.
Well, that's an old one. It's like Chris Van Ellsberg, the guy who did the Polar Express, did that. So it's an old book. It's gorgeous.
Okay, but anyway, Die is in many ways kind of a cross between Jumanji and It. I think at least that's the way that I read it. And so you have a group of individuals. There are 5 people. And he goes by Dominique, but also the name Ash at times. Who seems to be the protagonist, his sister Angela, and then 3 friends of theirs, Saul or Solomon, Chuck, and Isabella. And they get together on Dominique and Solomon's birthday because they have the same birthday. And they're playing this role-playing game, something kind of like a D&D game.
And Matthew. Did you leave Matthew out? There's a guy named Matthew.
I forgot. Yeah, it's Matthew. Yeah, so there's 6 of them. Yeah. Matthew is the one who seems to be the most level-headed of the group.
Yep. He's the quiet one.
Right. So you have these 6 individuals. They get together to play this role-playing game. And this is something that Solomon has cooked up. And he gives each, we see this toward the beginning of this first issue, he gives each person there a particular die.
Mm-hmm.
And each die has a certain number of sides. So it could be 6 or 4 or however many, right? 8,
Right.
24, however, I can't remember the numbers. But each of them have a particular die. And there's something about the die that is quote unquote special and foreboding in many ways. And we can even sense this from the very beginning. And I can't remember the first person who rolls the die, but at that point, we're transported to something that happens 2 years later. And apparently the 6 of them had gone missing.
Mm-hmm.
And then for 2 years they were missing. And then all of a sudden they appear back.
But only 5 of them.
Only 5 of them, right. Solomon is nowhere to be found.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, the remaining 5, the way that they put it, can't talk about it. So what is it? And this is the big mystery. Is it that they've made an agreement not to talk about it, and so they can't? Or are they literally unable, through whatever kind of magical means, to recall what happened? I mean, we can't talk about it because we don't know. We have no clue. Or is it something like they made an agreement, or if they say something, something's going to happen to Solomon? We don't know for certain. And then it fast forwards, what is it, 20 years, I think, when these guys are adults. And so Dominique, or Ash, is at a bar with his sister Angela, and the bartender gives him a package and says, "This was left for you." And he opens it, and it's the die that Solomon had, and there's blood on it. And so at this point, Dominique, or Ash, decides that he's going to he wants to smash the thing. He just wants to get rid of it. But he feels that he should talk with the others about it. So he and Angela get together with Chuck, Isabella, and Matthew, and they kind of figure out, okay, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to give away what happens toward the end of this first issue, because certain questions, at least to some minor degree, are answered, but there's still quite a number of question marks, as well they should, by the end of this first issue. I like this. I played as a youth D&D when I was in high school, and maybe even my first year in college. But I'm really not a Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing game fan much anymore. So I wondered how I would like this first issue of Die. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. It was one of those books that in the solicit I thought looked very good, and there were a couple page previews, but this is like almost everything a first issue had, everything I'm looking for in a first issue. Like you said, there's lots of questions, there's intriguing setup, and then by the end, there is a question or two answered, but there's a lot more circumstances and things that are raised that leave you with even more questions that you didn't even know you had. And it's one of the things I appreciate. I did not play as much D&D when I was a kid. I'm aware of it, and I played it a few times. It just wasn't something I got into. But one of the things we need a whammy. We need like the. But I know Debbie Downer. But I like it. And one of the things I liked about it too is kind of when they were getting the dice from Sol or Solomon, is that he was, it was like a special birthday game, or they were running a special birthday game, and everyone had to create characters, and they kind of got the die, their own particular die, according to Sol's assessment of how creative or interesting their character was, which I thought was a funny way to kind of get their personalities out in quick fashion. You think about a first issue and there being 6 characters and it being kind of difficult to kind of, get them established as character types and see how they're going to bounce off each other. And I thought it was a very clever way to do it, in that, they have very clear roles in terms of the game. And then you look at their characters, and then they kind of get, the relative worth assessed through the die that they get. And I laughed a lot because who was the one? Was it Ash? Ash is the one, I think, that just no Chuck. Chuck is the one that's like supposed to be, you know, kind of like the dopey jock guy.
Right. You know, the carefree guy and who actually turns out to be wealthy as an adult.
Yeah.
It's big.
Right. Who kind of, yeah. Well, I won't tell you what he does, but yes, he is able to take whatever happened and monetize it.
Yeah.
I'll just say that. Whereas the other ones kind of hold it as a burden or try to bury it. Because what I thought of with this is actually Nightmare on Elm Street, which similar in that, you know, some kind of horrific thing happened in the past and it kind of creeps around the edges. And, you know, I guess that's in the it fashion too. It's kind of a horror that they dealt with. It just, you know, it doesn't have the children, I guess. But my whole point is that it really made me laugh when Chuck is the guy who basically everyone else is very thoughtful about their character. And Chuck is basically like, I don't know what character I like, but I wanted to be able to do this, this, and this. And it's like, he just came up with a whole bunch of abilities. Yeah. So he gets the crappiest die. He's like, oh yeah,
you get six-sided, right?
Right. He's like, yeah, you get this one. He's like, you just get this, you know, crappy die. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a commentary about, you know, like lowest common denominator or taste or something that, you know, he's able to operationalize this thing in a way that other people aren't, or he doesn't care. I don't know. Things just seem to roll off him. Like you said, he's kind of happy-go-lucky. You know, I think they say his brains are made of sherbet or something like that
yeah.
at some point. But, you know, clearly he's worthwhile to the group in some manner, or else they wouldn't hang out with him. But
yeah. Now, both Kieron Gillen and Stephanie Hans have worked on Wicked and Divine. I mean, obviously Kieron Gillen does, and I think Hans has filled in at times.
Right.
Have you been following, or do you read?
I read I read the first trade.
Wicked and Divine, yeah.
I read the first trade, and I read a lot of I think I probably have read all of Phonogram, which Gillen did before that, which isn't necessarily the same, but you know, I enjoy the kind of storytelling he does. I really appreciate.
Yeah, I do as well. And like you, I read the first narrative arc of The Wicked and Divine, and I kind of held off going beyond that because I wanted to. It's kind of similar to what I was mentioning about Lapham's Stray Bullets, Sunshine and Roses. Is I'm waiting for it to end so that I can take it in all at once. You know, I found, kind of as a side note, over the past several years, I do less reading that I would just define as serialized, right? And have been more apt to wait until something is completed and then read it as a larger chunk, you know, and maybe not, you know, all in one sitting, but at least I have the option of going from, let's say, one issue, what would have originally been one issue, to the next, to the next, to the next, until I get to the end. And the reason for that, I think, is, and again, this is kind of a tangent, is that many times, you know, a month would go by, I'd read a lot of things within that month. And so let's say picking up a new issue of The Wicked and Divine, I would forget what the previous issue was about. So I'd have to go back and reread the earlier one, and maybe even the one before that, to get caught up and to refresh myself on, okay, what's going on in this story now? And then I'd read the new one. And I kind of got tired of doing that because that's, you know, quite a bit of time that you're committing yourself to. So it's like, I'll just wait until it's done. So yeah, with The Wicked and Divine, I read that first arc, and then I'm just waiting for things to wrap up, and then I'll probably read everything all at once. But I really enjoyed that story. Phonograph, like you say, is also really good. So I was on board for Die #1 when I first saw it solicited, and you and I were talking about it, and I'm not disappointed.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm a lot like you. You know, there's a part of me that loves serial narratives, and then there's a part of me that gets frustrated just because I kind of want them all at once, and they seem to be designed, some of them, for the trade nowadays. I mean, that's one of the things about the Lodger, you know, issue 1 and issue 2, and I don't know if the hard copies reflect this, but our PDF copies, the page numbering just continues. Issue 2 doesn't start on page 1; it starts on page whatever,
with the
18
Lodger
or 17 or 20 or whatever. So, you know, they're obviously looking forward. It's 5 issues. This is meant for a trade at some point. So, you know, there's a part of me that loves being on the hook at the end for like a cliffhanger, and then there's a part of me that's like, well, I just want it all at once to see kind of how it hangs together, because there is that.
So Die is also going to be 5 issues?
No, I don't know. I don't know how long Die is going to be.
Because I'm looking at the Image site right now, and on their just general information about the series, I don't see any indication of how many issues it may be.
Mm-hmm.
And on, let me see, their website for issue number 1, it doesn't indicate that either. And I think it's the same with 2. So, I mean, this could be something that may be ongoing in a way that maybe the Lodger won't be.
Yeah, it says the news on their solicit site says that it's an ongoing fantasy comic. So it should just, I guess go until it's done, or if it ever ends up done. But I think it's got a lot of potential, and I don't say this in a hugely pejorative way, but a lot of times I read an Image comic of late, and there's a lot, they put out a healthy number of number 1s, and I appreciate the variety of things that they do put out. Every once in a while I read one and I'm like, this just feels like a Netflix pitch to me. And it's like, okay, they're hoping it catches on or something like that. But I also feel like this is not that. This seems a lot nuanced. This I think the premise here has legs for an ongoing that you could, I don't know. There's a lot of issues. But because it's got built on that D&D framework. I mean, as long as you have ideas and you have some sense, spark of creativity, you could, there's an infinite number of characters that could enter in on this. I mean, and what goes on with the 6 of them. I mean, filling in their backstory is going to be one thing, and then kind of where they go from there is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little more cynical than you. I agree with you in terms of Image titles. Many times they seem to be almost coded, so to speak, pitches for a Netflix series or something like that. But you didn't see this so much as one. I mean, I don't know. I mean, when I read this, I did mention that I thought of it and Jumanji. I also thought of Stranger Things, an original Netflix series, and it's not unlike Stranger Things. So, I'm sure that this is in the mind of about every creator or creative team who comes out with an Image comic. Almost to the point that, and this is something when Paul was co-hosting the show, we'd mentioned this 2 or 3 times on the Comics Alternative. And that is, after a while, it seemed like many of these Image series seemed to be about the same in one form or another, just kind of different twists or different perspectives or different approaches to very similar premises or storylines. And again, maybe I'm being a little too negative, even cynical here, but I mean, I like this. I don't know how original the story is or it's going to be, but I'd like to keep on reading.
Yeah, I think it's compelling. And I wonder if it's almost like a zeitgeist thing or something that's visible in a way. I mean, I think about, in a way, I mean, sometimes a certain thing happens and it becomes cool. I'm doing air quotes. It's cool. I can do that here. But like when Die Hard came out. When Die Hard came out, everyone was like, oh my God, Die Hard is amazing. And then there was like Die Hard on a plane, Die Hard with the president on a plane, Die Hard in a shopping mall, Die Hard on, it was like, there were,
by the way, I never thought Die Hard was amazing.
Well,
that's me.
You were a minority because there was a lot of people that were like, Die Hard is the best thing ever. And we need to make a million versions of it with different actors and different scenarios. And it's like, that was like part of the air. But then I also think about kind of the cyclical things that we used to see. Like when I will speak for myself. When I was a kid in the 70s, the 50s were cool. So like everything was like Fonzie and like set with like old time rock and roll. And like, that was something that showed up again and again and again. And now it seems like, I don't know if it's the 80s or whatnot. I mean, the D&D thing, definitely the Stranger Things.
Yeah.
That's like an 80s. I mean, that's like, that's how people would describe it to me. They're like, oh my God, it's like Spielberg, it like had a love child with like every 80s thing you love and it's there. And it's like, and now maybe that's, I don't know, the people who are in charge or the tastemakers or the whatever movers and shakers in the media that we consume are like, that's the stuff that they're into. So we get Ready Player One and whatever else that
Well, I'm a believer that there is kind of a 20-year lag of what is hip or cool, again, air quotes, hip or cool. But no, I mean, you're right. In the 1970s, it was the 1950s. I don't know if in the 1980s it was the 60s. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the 60s, but definitely now, 20 years later, they're the 80s, and there are all these references to the 80s, 80s games, 80s culture, 80s music, and Stranger Things is an example of that. And in fact, I think my son started watching Stranger Things before my wife and I watched the series. And the thing that he was playing up there, how cool the 80s were. And, my wife and I were, growing up in the 80s and we're going to college in the 80s, high school and college. And we were a little more negative. It's like, wasn't that cool? There are a lot of crappy things that went on in the 1980s, and not just culturally speaking, but, it's also, and again, my political leanings, the Reagan era, which, a lot of people will praise. But I don't know. But I do think that there is that 20-year lag. So, in 2020 some, we'll be looking at the 1990s as the pinnacle of pop culture.
Hey, well, it kind of makes me wonder about what to bring in a little circle to the Shea book too. Do people in hindsight want to just look at the positive or what they define as the positive thing? Because I know what you're talking about. That not everyone was enamored with Reagan, and there were a lot of things he did that I think set us up in negative ways for a lot of the kind of difficulties we have to contend with nowadays. And so, but there's a certain segment of the population, or maybe even larger, that kind of, like they don't remember that. They just remember like tear down this wall and, he was avuncular and like jelly beans. And like, you don't remember, and it was a boom years for the American economy for the most part.
Later.
So,
right. Early it was different.
Right. So they're like, oh yeah, that's what we're going to remember. We're going to remember the good parts. Like with Shea, it's like, well, we'll remember the good parts. And, he might have done some horrible things, but we'll just put them to the side because we really like to focus on these good parts, whatever they are, and, highlight those, and I don't know, because it's an interesting recapitulation of things. Cause I agree with you. And I think the D&D framework is, it's dated.
Coming back to die, number one.
Yeah. Yeah. Coming back to die. Cause it's like, it's an interesting framework. It's a generative framework because, inherently, that's the whole point of the game, is that you could technically play one game forever as long as you had whoever in charge of it be invested in the game and want to keep adding twists or making content or however you want to talk about it. So, I don't know. I think it's got a potential. I will read it in a trade. Like you said, I tend to read a lot more things in chunks. But I'm intrigued. I think it's interesting, and I think I kind of like that it's got some gruesome aspects. I don't want to spoil things, but it's fantasy, but it's not shiny, glowing fantasy. It's kind of gross and bloody fantasy.
Well, there you have it. The three texts that Sterg and I looked at this week, our 301st episode of the Weekly Review Show. We started off with John Lee Anderson and José Hernández's graphic biography, Che, A Revolutionary Life, published by Penguin Press. After that, we looked at the first two issues of The Lodger by David and Maria Lapham, and this is coming out through IDW's Black Crown imprint. And then we wrapped up with a discussion of the very first issue of Kieron GIllen and Stephanie Hans's Die, and that is an Image release.
Yeah, and we did this live, I want you to know.
Yes, we did. This is our very first live streaming episode, and one of the things that Sterg and I are going to discuss is the possibility of doing something like this in the future. We don't know if we will. I've had a good time doing this. We've thought about making this maybe a part of our Patreon revamp. We may or we may not. Who knows? But I do think that it is, if we continue doing this regularly, an option for people to not just see what we're doing a little early. And we should mention, Sterg and I normally record the week's episode late Monday morning. Like it has been like around 10 o'clock. It's just that this week, Sterg, I think you had something going on campus
Oh, yeah.
On Monday, so we needed to do it today. But if we do continue to do this either on a regular basis or occasionally, it'll probably be on a Monday morning. But we'll get in touch with all of you. And I've noticed right now we have 3 viewers. It'd be great to have more. But at one point, I think we had 6.
Hi, viewers.
Hi. And I know that people pop in and pop out, and that's fine. Some of these may be viewers that we know, and I know some of them are people, as we've seen in the comments on our YouTube channel, people who are not only Patreon supporters, but who are regular listeners to the show. So we appreciate that. So I think it's been a pretty successful experiment. I was wondering if this would have ended in a disaster. For instance, we'd have technical difficulties. I think my wife at one point, well, she watched us. She's probably not on now because she's at work, but she watched us for a while, and she texted me, I think within the first 30 minutes, and said that my image was frozen. So I changed the bandwidth usage from high to kind of medium, and I think I still look okay video-wise, but also it allowed me to fix that freeze-up problem because she texted me right after I changed it and said, yeah, I see you animated again. So that's good. We got the feedback and we had people watching us, and I had a good time doing this. Who knows if we're going to continue doing this in the episodes to come, but it was fun.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. I think you look great, by the way, and I also had fun. Yeah.
And you know, if you want to have fun with comics, how's this for a segue? Then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. You know, you really can't go wrong with the wonderful folks at dcbservice.com. Not only do they offer discounts that you really can't beat. I haven't found a place yet, either brick and mortar or online, whose prices are better. But they also have a great friendly staff that will work with you. So if you have a question about something that you want to order or something that you have ordered, or even if you're late with your orders, I can tell you from personal experience, they definitely work with you there. That's Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us. Let us know what you're reading. And also let us know what you think about our first live streaming exercise. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or if you want to email us both, you can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or if you just want to email me, I'm Sterg at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. So contact us that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Podcasts. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right, Derek.
That's right.
We're on brand.
That's right. And, you know, we may have picked up some viewers of people who had never listened to the podcast, but they're just, I don't know, going around YouTube, seeing what kind of live things are going on. If you don't know about the Comics Alternative, definitely check us out. It's comicsalternative.com. And we will discuss almost any kind of comic as long as it's not mainstream superhero. I mean, that's right. Not that we don't like that stuff. We read it. It's just we don't discuss it on the Comics Alternative. And for this reason, there are tons of comics podcasts out there, a lot of really good ones. And almost all of them deal, if not exclusively, then mostly with the superheroes from DC and Marvel universes. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. But when we founded the Comics Alternative back in 2012, so it's been a little over 6 years, we decided that we would do something different. Now, automatically that limits our potential audience, but at the same time, we offer something that no other comics podcast offers. There are other podcasts that deal with alternative comics or indie comics exclusively, but many of those are just, let's say, only interviews or only review shows. We do the reviews, we do the interviews, we do the on location, we have a variety of monthly series. In other words, we do it all in terms of comics and comics culture, except for DC Marvel Universe. superheroes. So, we're something different. And if you haven't checked us out before, please do so. You can also check us out on Patreon. So you can go to patreon.com/comicsalternative or go to our website, comicsalternative.com, and click through our Patreon links. We'd appreciate the support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got lots of content in there too. There's interviews, there's reviews, there's all kinds of things.
That's right. And we have 2 more episodes left in 2018, and we can tell you now what those are going to be. And it's the same every year. Our penultimate episode of the year is always, or almost always, last year was a little late, our look at the current year's Best American Comics volume from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So next week, Sterg and I are going to be looking at Best American Comics 2018, and we'll also probably have an interview with the series editor Bill Cardelopoulos that same week on a separate episode. And then the very last show of 2018 is always what we consider our favorites of the past year. And on that episode, Sterg and I will talk about what we consider, each of us consider, our 10 favorites from the past year. And we won't share that one with the other until we actually do the recording. So Sterg, you don't know, or you won't know what my 10 favorites are. You can guess, but you won't know. And then vice versa. I could maybe guess what 1 or 2 of yours might be, but I don't know for certain until you actually talk about it. And so that's always fun. So definitely come back and listen to our last 2 shows of the year. Again, next week is going to be our look at Best American Comics 2018. And then the final show of the year will be what Sterg and I consider some of our favorites for the past year. And also we're planning on this as well. The very first show of 2019, as it has been for the last several years, will be another interview with Craig Yo, a series that we like to call Happy New Yo.
Yo. And for the record, I don't even know my top 10. They come to me in an envelope next week from Price Waterhouse.
Okay, good. So I hope the mail's not late.
Yes, no snow.
Okay.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So again, we will be back next week. And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg.
We'll see you later.
Peace.